Hello, this is Hannes again from the Department of Computing at Curtin University. I want to talk to you about big data. Big data has that name because, strangely enough, it is really, really big. For the last decade or so, the volume of data we collect has increased staggeringly. There's various interesting statistics on that, on how much data we're collecting to, previous time periods, but what it comes down to is your average retail chain collects so much data that no human can manually go through even a small portion of that, because they are collecting data on everything. Let's look at just your typical store. They of course have data on what they have in their warehouse and what they have on their shelves. That data needs to be updated every time they sell something and also as new shipment comes in. They'll also have data on what they sell, and that also means they're tracking data on all their customers. They then will have higher level data that looks at the connections between the two, so what sort of customers are likely to buy what sort of goods, and if we change prices, what in the past effect has that had on the volume of sales, again based on particular customers. So they will have a lot of data, and every day, every minute, every second, they will generate more data. And just when they collect the data, analyzing it creates even more data. So the sheer amount of data collected is quite staggering. You then have to store that data somewhere, or maybe send it somewhere first, because normally the place you store it isn't the same place you collect the data. As a fairly interesting example of that, the Murchison Wide Field Array, which is going to become the Square Kilometre Array, that is collecting far more data than they can send along the cable that leaves the site, which is after all in the middle of the desert. They can't store the data on site. They are collecting, I don't know, a magnitude of 1,000 amount more data than they can actually send. So that means they have to process the data a lot, take out the important information and send it along. And that's the whole thing about big data. Big data has its own challenges and it has quite considerable rewards. That's why businesses are so keen on the concept. A common way to think about big data is to talk about 4 V's. Velocity of data, variety of data, volume of data, and veracity of data. Velocity is how fast the data is coming in, because of course that will impact how much you have to process, how quickly you have to deal with it. Variety is different sorts of data, because even in the store example, there's not just one sort of data. You're not just collecting data at the tills. There's a lot of other information that feeds into it, especially when you start generating your data yourself based on analyzing the initial data. The volume of data is how much data is coming in once and how much you have to store. Because in some cases you won't store all of the data, but as has been mentioned previously, you may need to, especially if you think in the future you want to ask new questions. If you have all of your data available, you can ask any question you can think of. But if you only have very carefully edited data, you can't do that. And last but perhaps most importantly is veracity. Is your data telling the actual and true story? You want to make sure that all the data you collect is carefully vetted. There's a variety of reasons for that. One is that if you're going to make decisions based on this data, why else would you collect it? Then you want to make sure those decisions are based on good data. You can have a look at fairly much any government in the world to see what happens if you make decisions on bad data. And that is something that you just can't handle in private enterprise. More importantly, there are probably legal implications of data you need to store and how you can deal with that data. So you want to make sure that you're not collecting incorrect data or storing incorrect data for those reasons, especially if you're, for example, in a medical profession or anything related to that. And that is a basic idea of some of the concepts of big data. There's a fair bit more involved, but it has become an industry entirely in itself. And the people who know how to deal with big data tend to be very, very much sought after in many fields.